If you've been suspended during a workplace investigation, you may be wondering whether your employer is permitted to do this. I'm Mike from Cash and Legal, and in this video, I'm going to cover the topic of suspensions during workplace investigations. More specifically, I'm going to cover the topic of why your employer might suspend your employment during an investigation and whether or not this is legal. I'll also provide some basic recommendations on how to respond if you have been suspended from your employment. Before I get started, it's important to stress that the information provided in this video is general in nature and may not be applicable to your circumstances. If you have been suspended by your employer, it is never too early to seek legal advice. These are fluid and complex situations, and legal advice can help you navigate the situation clearly and confidently. If you are wondering how to respond to a workplace investigation, do not hesitate to click the link to our website in the description to this video and book a consultation with our office today. The first topic I want to cover is why your employer might suspend your employment. There are a number of reasons why an employer might suspend someone's employment during a workplace investigation. In our experience, there are generally 3 reasons why employers suspend employees during a workplace investigation. The first reason is to protect the safety of the workplace. The second reason is to protect the integrity of the investigation itself. And the third reason is that the employer wants to clearly establish that the alleged conduct is not permitted within the workplace. Let's unpack these 3 reasons in detail. In order to protect the safety of a workplace, an employer may suspend you during an investigation to ensure that no further misconduct occurs. Employers owe significant obligations to their employees under statute and the common law. These obligations include protecting the privacy of employees' confidential information, taking steps to protect the employees from harassment and discrimination within the workplace, and doing the best the employer can to foster a workplace of civility, decency, and respect. Due to these significant duties, if the employer learns that there might be misconduct occurring in the workplace that impinges on one of these responsibilities, they're required to take reasonable steps to stop that misconduct. This means that if your employer receives a credible allegation that you have engaged in some type of misconduct that might impact another employee's legal rights, they might have strong grounds to suspend you from your employment. This brings us to the second consideration that justifies suspensions during an investigation, which is protecting the integrity of the investigation itself. When an employer receives an allegation of misconduct, they're required to take these allegations seriously, which usually involves investigating the allegations. In order to ensure that the investigation occurs in a fair and impartial manner, the employer might be required to suspend the impugned employee during this process. This ensures that the impugned employee doesn't try to intimidate participants in the investigation or otherwise interfere with the investigation process. If the employer does not suspend the employee during the investigation, that employee may be able to tamper with the investigation by trying to influence people to answer their questions in a particular way. As a result, protecting the integrity of the investigation might be a valid reason to administratively suspend an employee during the investigation. Finally, the third reason that an employer may suspend you during an investigation is to clearly denounce the alleged conduct. If an employer learns of misconduct and doesn't act quickly enough to denounce that misconduct, the employer may be deemed to have consented to that misconduct. Because of this, an employer may suspend your employment even if they have not yet determined whether the misconduct occurred, because if they ultimately determine that it did at a later date, they can demonstrate that they took the earliest possible opportunity to denounce the misconduct. This provides the employer with the opportunity to both denounce the misconduct, but also conduct a fair and impartial investigation to take the time it needs to determine whether the misconduct actually occurred. Now that we've established why an employer may suspend your employment during an investigation, let's answer the question of whether or not the suspension is legal. There is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question, and each case is dependent on its own facts. However, there are some common factors that we can look at in order to determine whether or not a suspension is legal. The first and most important question to determine the legality of a workplace suspension is whether or not the suspension is with or without pay. In the non-unionized context, it is generally understood that employers are not permitted to suspend employees without pay. Part of the reason for this is that suspending an employee without pay is an act of discipline. It's not an investigative measure taken to protect the integrity of the investigation or to protect the workplace itself. By suspending an employee without pay, the employer is effectively communicating that it accepts that the employee engaged in the alleged misconduct and needs to be disciplined for this misconduct. As a result, most courts will consider a suspension without pay to be an act of constructive dismissal. So, if your employer has suspended your employment and has communicated to you that the suspension is without pay, we strongly encourage you to seek legal advice because you might have significant remedies that flow from this situation. Another important consideration are the legitimacy of the reasons for the suspension itself. Coming back to the considerations that I shared earlier on in this video, if your employer has received a legitimate complaint about your conduct, then that supports their ability to administratively suspend you while they investigate those allegations. However, on the flip side, if the employer receives information that is not credible or there isn't a realistic basis for the allegations against you, this reduces the employer's ability to validly suspend your employment. To be clear, these circumstances are relatively rare, but we do see in some situations that employers will suspend employees administratively without sufficient justification to do so. These situations can arise where there's no legitimate allegation against the employee, there's fabricated evidence, or there just is simply nothing to substantiate the alleged conduct against the employee. In these situations, a suspension might not be legal. However, it's important to stress that just because you disagree with the allegations against you, that doesn't mean there isn't some legitimate basis for the allegations. Another important consideration is the duration of the suspension itself. If a suspension occurs in the context of a workplace investigation, the suspension can only last as long as is reasonably required to complete the investigation. Now, there is no hard and fast rule about how long a workplace investigation should take. Some investigations can be resolved in a matter of days, and others can take months in order to be resolved. Regardless, if an employer keeps an employee suspended once the investigation is complete for an arbitrarily long period of time, this suggests that the suspension may no longer be valid. What should you do if you've been suspended by your employer? If you disagree with the reasons for your suspension, you should clearly communicate to your employer that you dispute the allegations against you. It is important that you do not sign anything that acknowledges either the legitimacy of the suspension or the truth of the allegations that have been made against you. Having said that, it's important to stress that all communications with your employer should be firm but professional to ensure you're clearly communicating your position but not crossing any lines when doing so. If your employer has recently suspended your employment and you're wondering what to do, we can assist you with this. We provide employees facing workplace suspensions with clarity about their situation, strategies for next steps, and peace of mind through sound advice and strong legal representation. If you have any questions about how to proceed, click the link to our website in the description to this video and book a consultation with our office today.